Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Josie from Greenlight, and we are thrilled to host tonight's event with Stephen Vider presenting his new book, The Queerness of Home, Gender, Sexuality, and the Politics of Domesticity After World War II. He'll be talking with Peter Terzian, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thank you to Stephen, Peter, and the team at University of Chicago Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up tonight. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things before we begin. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here, though, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Queerness of Home, is available for sale at Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 to 8 p.m. at both of our locations, or you can purchase Stephen's book and many others on site. You can also order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop the buy link in the chat. And as a thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we're offering 10% off the featured book. You can enter the coupon code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section at checkout online for 10% off. And now to the good stuff. Our interviewer tonight is Peter Terzian. Peter is the features editor of Travel and Leisure magazine. He has written for the Paris Review, Book Forum, the New York Times, and other publications. He'll be speaking with our featured author, Stephen Vider, Assistant Professor of History in the direction of the Public History Initiative at Cornell University. His writing has appeared in American Quarterly, Gender and History, Transition, and The Public Historian, as well as the New York Times, Slate, and Avidly, among other places. In his new book, The Queerness of Home, Peter shows that the intimacy of domestic space has been just as crucial to the history of post-war LGBTQ life as public activism, explaining how LGBTQ activists train their attention on the home as a site of connection, care, and cultural inclusion, and by doing so, realize new forms of community and culture for themselves and new possibilities of home life for everyone. Stephen is going to start us off with a brief introduction to the book, and then he'll be talking with Peter and with all of you. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Josie. I want to start by thanking you and everyone at Greenlight for making this event possible, and also thanking Peter for agreeing to take part as the interviewer for today. I'm just really thrilled to get to see you and to be in conversation with you about the book.
Thank you.
Let me go ahead and share my screen. And I just want to give a little bit of a brief kind of overview of the book before we begin with questions. So The Queerness of Home is about the many ways that home shapes what it means to belong in American culture and politics. And it looks at that specifically by tracing how queer and trans people have navigated and challenged what home looks like. There's so many different ways that home shapes the norms of gender, sexuality, race, and class in American culture. And the book really begins in the 1950s, which is a moment kind of after World War II, where a particular model of the breadwinner homemaker household, the kind of husband-wife household with kids, it really is sort of ascendant and being prioritized in American politics and culture by the government and by mainstream culture more largely, right, as kind of the model of what American life should look like. And even though that the reality never always and everywhere matches the rhetoric, that rhetoric was still incredibly oppressive, especially to queer and trans people and people of color. The Queerness of Home tries to challenge that vision of what the domestic order looked like after World War II by tracing the ways that queer and trans people navigated domestic life and try to adapt these norms of domestic life for themselves and really lay claim to home space as a site of community formation and political activism. I just want to say a little bit too about kind of the impetus for writing the book. There is really one of the things I really wanted to try to do in the book is correct a kind of popular narrative, but also a lot of academic histories about LGBTQ politics and culture that really treat public space and public activism as kind of the major site of action, right, in queer and trans history, right? And really allied what's happening in more private and domestic spaces. And I also really wanted to kind of expand on the ways that queer studies and queer theory scholars have been talking about home, which was to tend to think about home as a space of constraint and oppression for queer and trans people. To kind of make that intervention, I'm really building especially on feminist theory that has for a long time really challenged a kind of caricature from the 1950s and 60s of home life as oppressive and constraining. The book moves from the 1940s up to the 1990s to try to trace the many different ways that queer and trans people were navigating these norms. Kind of begins in the 1940s and 50s, looking at new models of extra-legal gay and lesbian marriage, and then camp domesticity. It then moves into the 60s and 70s to think about some of the ways that queer and trans people were trying to more radically and publicly remake the home, with a chapter on communes and lesbian architecture. And finally, it moves to the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when queer and trans people were also beginning to start to think about those most marginalized in their communities, with a chapter on queer and trans homeless shelters and group homes and caregiving for people living with HIV/AIDS. I'll say kind of over the span of this book, one thing you'll notice even from the images is that you start to see more people of color and more trans people as the book moves from 1940s to 90s, as there's kind of growing kind of more radical responses to home life that are really also calling out the home's whiteness and challenging not only its kind of class norms, but also its racial norms. And also, you know, I'm also working in the book to really challenge any kind of essential idea of what the queer community is, right, or what the Black queer community is, but to really think about the ways that all of these activists are using home to try to push the boundaries of what their communities look like, push the boundaries of what their home lives look like. Across this time, one of the things that I find is that home life actually becomes more and more central in queer and trans activism from the 40s to the 90s, and also that queer and trans people are really increasingly pushing on the boundaries of what home can look like. I want to give just a few examples too, of sort of how this plays out in the book. So one of the chapters in the book looks at the work of an architect named Phyllis Berkby, who was a lesbian architect who kind of rose to prominence in the 60s and 70s. And she had this idea that the only way that women were going to be able to change the built environment, change the way that architecture looked, change the way that homes looked, was by this practice she called the fantasy environment exercise, where she'd ask women in groups to literally draw, as you can see here, what their fantasy dwellings, like what their fantasy homes might look like. And so this leads to some really radical and fantastic ideas of what home can be. This is a drawing called My Block by Joan or Lavender Lane in the city of Sisterly Love, that tries to reimagine a kind of city block that you might see in New York, but reimagining it as a kind of mixed kind of community and residential space. I think with like a big dining space and a library. You'll also notice on the top right there, there's a soundproof scream room or planetarium, just to keep options open. The picture on the cover of the book is this photograph from Survival House, which was one of the earliest group homes for LGBTQ homeless youth in the country, that was founded in the early 1970s by a man named Effie Mitchell. And the major source for thinking about this for me are these photographs, but also this documentary taken by Bruce Pavlov, who was at the time just an undergraduate architecture student at UC Berkeley, who was taking a new class on gay space and decided he would explore and photograph and video people at Survival House and think about the ways that they were remaking what home and family looked like. Finally, the last chapter of the book focuses on the buddy program and other forms of caregiving practices for people living with HIV/AIDS. And this is a photograph of two people in the buddy program, which was an early volunteer caregiving program founded by Gay Men's Health Crisis, or GMHC, in New York. And you can see that volunteer Kachin on the left and her buddy, Michael, who was living with AIDS at the time that this photograph was taken. And the thing that really strikes me with all of these images is the ways that they all really work to challenge the boundary of the public and the private, that we often think about the public and the private as really kind of opposed to each other. But if you think about something like the buddy program, you have a caregiver actually entering into someone's home, right? And into their most intimate lives. Here, Kachin laying in bed with Michael and providing a new kind of support that I think really begins to expand what home might look like. And in the book, I think about also this as a form of coalitional intimacy, where people are actually beginning to challenge the boundaries of what their communities look like through this kind of embodied caregiving. And that's really, I think, the key for me throughout the book, right, is not just about thinking about what's happening in private, but the ways that queer people were actually challenging the very boundaries and limitations of what home could be. And in doing that, not only reinvented their own communities and lives, but reimagined what home could be for everyone. Stop sharing there.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's so good to see you. We haven't seen each other in a long time in person. We've been friends for almost 20 years now. And I wish we could be doing this event at the Greenlight bookstore. But I'm delighted to be here and honored that you asked me to do this, particularly because we've talked about this book over the years. You showed me an early version of it, I think in 2014. But even some years before that, we talked about various elements of it. I think one of the first things I remember is that you were telling me about the Gay Cookbook, which I think was like in 2008 or 2009, which appears in the second chapter. So it's been nice to see those various elements come together. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the book evolved for you as a project, what the initial spark was, and how the various threads came together.
Thanks so much for that question, Peter. I'll say with the Gay Cookbook, that happened kind of serendipitously. I had been really interested when I first got to graduate school in kind of new emerging area in food studies and food history that was really trying to think about the ways that food kind of connected to norms of gender, sexuality, and race. But there was almost nothing on queer history. And when I was speaking at this, an ex-boyfriend of mine mentioned that he had actually bought a copy of this Gay Cookbook called the Gay Cookbook at a used bookstall at the Strand. And that kind of set me off on a sort of historic deep dive to find out more about the book. And from there, it really began to kind of open kind of larger questions for me about kind of what home looked like over time for queer people, right? That Hogan was writing about wrote the Gay Cookbook in 1965 at a moment when a lot of mainstream depictions of queer people tended to imagine them as sort of not having homes of their own, sort of imagine them sort of kind of on this kind of going to bars and on the street and almost as a kind of threat. And Hogan wanted instead to imagine queer life at home. But that kind of opened up for me a kind of larger question about the wide range of different ways that that queer people were making home over time, that that didn't seem to be represented anywhere in the kind of larger kind of queer histories that I was reading.
Well, I was looking through some old emails that we exchanged years ago, and one of the things that you said was that you had decided to change dissertation topics when you and your husband, David, were planning your wedding, and that getting married had made you think about how people work within cultural norms and traditions to create something new. So I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about what you were thinking at the time vis-a-vis that in particular, and how your own experience of marriage over the years has shaped this book as well.
That's a great question. I'll say that, David and I were together for about 5 years before we got married. And this was also, I'll say, at a time, and this is about 2010, when same-sex marriage was recognized in some states, but not others. It was not recognized federally yet, but this is before the DOMA case and the Obergefell case. And it really raised a lot of questions for me and for us about kind of what were we doing by getting married, right? Were we endorsing a particular kind of specific model about what home life was supposed to be? We talked about, like, do we want to use the term husband? Do we want to use the term partner? Right? And what do these different terms mean? I think one thing also I was really anxious about, whether getting married was somehow going to turn our whole 5-year relationship until that point as a kind of just prelude to getting married, right? And we had been celebrating our dating anniversary. Would that simply disappear, right, under the weight of, right, our wedding anniversary, which is so much more public? And at that time, I was not writing about marriage. I was actually writing about the communes in the book. And I think that was a way of kind of beginning to press and think about, right, that marriage is one form, right, of home life, but there have been historically many other forms of home life that queer people have experimented with. And that there was a lot of political power in those experiments. One of the communes in the book was called a Gay Liberation Commune that was founded in Washington, D.C. in the 1970s, which was a multiracial, anti-racist commune, right, or living collective that was really trying to challenge ideas about race and family, and doing so in a really public way. There's a really wonderful image in the book of one of the members of the House named Reggie Haynes, who appears like in a gay pride parade, an early gay pride parade in New York, with a sign that says, "Our house is a very, very, very gay house," kind of playing on the song lyric. And the idea of making your home public in that way was a way of challenging, right, the norms of what home could be. And so part of my, I guess, impetus in writing the book, there was to also complicate our sense of kind of how did we get to the moment that we're in now? And could I uncover an archive of different domestic forms that might still draw inspiration for us, that might still challenge us?
Well, it's one of the things we've also talked about is that we both came from sort of, I don't want to say very unconventional households, but families that were set up a little bit to the left of the norm, in that we both had multi-generational families. Like in both of our cases, our grandmothers lived with us, and that sort of is an interesting thing, in that there is this idea of the post-war family as being mom and dad and 2 kids, but actually it was much more complicated than that. And I wonder how that, how your own experience of being in that, of having a grandmother live with you, of being in that sort of family, kind of changed your worldview and your view of history and storytelling, narrative.
It's so interesting, in part because it's something I think I've come to really understand more out of writing the book. As you were mentioning, I grew up in a 2-family house. My parents, my brother, and I lived on 1 floor, and my grandmother, my mother's mother, lived on the lower floor. And it was interesting, right? My grandmother was a piano teacher, and so there were also always her students kind of coming in and out of the house all the time. She was also very sick for a lot of the time that I was growing up, and in addition to the care that my family provided, at different points we also had at-home nurses who were living there with her and providing support. We lived down the block from the hospital, and so there were times when we were sort of just going, right? It just felt like the hospital room was sort of an extension of our home. And I think there were lots of people who actually were living in multi-generational homes at the time that I was growing up, but it didn't feel that way. And it was really hard to try to translate to other people, like what that experience was like to grow up kind of so close with a grandmother in the same house, and also to be living in such close proximity to somebody who was often very sick, and what that felt like. And to try, again, I think it felt weird to me to be growing up in that environment, even though it really wasn't that weird at all in a lot of ways. And that to me is kind of at the root of what I call, what I mean in the book when I talk about the queerness of home, right? That we think about the home, right, according to this norm that we've inherited, right, from the 40s on, of a particular kind of, mother-father household. But so many people's homes actually don't align and never aligned with that norm, and are a lot queerer or stranger than we think. I also I've, especially working on the last chapter in the book on HIV/AIDS, I think that I also came to really think a lot about the caregiving that had happened in our own home in the 1980s and 90s, and the ways that kind of caregiving often seems to get erased, right? With the case of HIV/AIDS, right, there is a lot of work and really wonderful work about the public activism that was happening, but there isn't as much about things like the buddy program and the caregiving that was happening in people's private spaces. And I think that we, by eliding that or forgetting that, we actually missed a lot of the story. I think because those stories are also really painful. I think it's part of why we ignore them often.
Yeah, I'm interested in caregiving as a sort of thread that goes through the book. There's a lot of tenderness in the book, and it extends even to something like Lou Rand Hogan, author of the Gay Cookbook. There's an element of him addressing, a gay person setting up a household. Let me give you some advice. Like, here's how you can actually prepare meals and take care of yourself. And so throughout the book, there are people sort of looking for care and finding it outside of the family unit. And it's kind of like, in a sense, like an alternative or a hidden history. So have these programs and projects changed the way that queer people think of caregiving? Do you think they've had like a sort of lasting effect in gay culture?
I think there is has been historically a different ethic around friendship and family in queer communities and trans communities that has been really key at moments, like especially I think in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I worry that kind of with marriage to some degree, that I mean, other people have made this critique as well, that I think there's a risk that we lose some of that sense of kind of a broader community. But I also think that there are lots of ways that kind of caregiving continue and that kind of model continues to resonate. That I'm, in the book, I'm thinking about Phyllis Berkby again, who, when at the end of her life, she's really cared for by a whole group of other queer women who had, been friends with her all her life. They call themselves the Sisters of Berkby or the SOBs, and they just come up with a whole schedule for who's going to take care of her. Right? She's somebody who never got, she had had a lot of different relationships, but she never was in a single long-term relationship over time. And so her friends really were really key as her support network. And then I think in the present, I've been really interested to see that there's this emergence of trans buddy programs to kind of help people through transitions. There's also all of these new group homes for older or elder LGBTQ people who have limited incomes, where that SAGE is now beginning to sponsor and build, right, with an understanding that a lot of people need that kind of community in their lives. So I don't think that it's an ethic that's been lost, but I think it's one we don't often talk enough about.
Okay, interesting. Well, this sort of, I'd like to also talk about your work as a curator. So you worked at the Museum of the City of New York, I think between 2016 and 2017. And while you were there, you worked on two really fantastic shows that I felt that were eye-opening for me. I felt very lucky to see them. One you co-curated, which was Gay Gotham, which was about the creative networks of LGBTQ people that extended through New York cultural life through the 20th century. And then the other was, which you curated yourself, was AIDS at Home, which focused on the way the domestic sphere during the AIDS epidemic became a space of caregiving and community. Can you talk about how your work on those projects fueled this book? Like, did they, there must have, in fact, I recognized some of the photographs, I think, from the chapter on the buddy program from the show, is that correct?
Yeah.
So I'd love to know how, I'd be interested sort of both specifically, like what you learned putting those shows together that you were able to put into the book. But also I'm kind of curious as to how maybe curating a show is different from or similar to writing a straightforward narrative, like writing a book.
It's a great question. I'll say that one thing that I really learned and kind of grew more and learned from working on both Gay Gotham and AIDS at Home was how to build a story and an argument out of many stories. Because I think one of the challenges of writing the book for me, right, is I'm trying to actually accumulate a lot of stories, like a lot of different stories, and pull them together and try to make sense of them, right? So I, in the chapter on shelters for homeless youth, I'm looking at a lot of different programs, right, and trying to make a narrative out of it. And I think that working on the exhibits helped me to think about, right, how do stories kind of accumulate over time, and how do you also use personal stories, especially, to make a larger kind of argument about the ways that culture and politics are shifting. I also had always been photographs were always really important to me in the research of the book, because photographs for me really captured everyday life in a way that was different, right, than other types of documents. And I think that working on the exhibits helped me actually to understand that more. So the buddy program photographs were in the exhibition, and I felt that they gave a lot, and they were in the exhibit alongside the documents from the buddy program from the New York Public Library. And I liked the way that those things interacted, right, that you had the details from the documents, but then you had all of the feeling from the photographs. And it really helped me to think about what I call in the book a domestic archive, right? How do we use objects, right, in photographs and images and video to uncover stories of everyday life? In terms of how is it different writing a book, I think that one of the things I think you can't trust people on an exhibit to read everything. People often read just the first text if they read anything, and then kind of move on. And I grew more comfortable with that, and again, to let the stories kind of make the argument for me. And it also really showed me that being in conversation with a lot of people impacted by HIV/AIDS, it really also shaped for me thinking about who this book was for and who this book might impact, and a sense that a lot of the stories that I was tracing in the book, these private stories, were things that had never been talked about publicly, and that might be really meaningful to share.
Speaking about the photography in the book, which is, you have some really fantastic images from photographs of, in the 1950s and 60s, gay and lesbian couples who were really sort of staging their own marriages at home in private, outside, they were not legally recognized, but they, there's snapshots of like two men in a suit cutting a wedding cake, or a lesbian couple just being at home together. And these go right through to the very moving photos of the buddy program. I think it's easy to forget today when we can go on Instagram and see just an infinity of images of gay people and trans people, how singular those photographs must have seemed at the time. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, about how important these artifacts were to the people who took them and who were the subjects of them. It kind of strikes me that someone taking a photo like that of an early gay wedding would likely have never seen such a photograph of another same-sex couple being married. So what do these photos mean to the people who were the subjects of them?
Well, maybe actually I can share, if I share my screen again, I can show just a few of the images that you were alluding to, just to give people a better sense of this. So I think these are the photographs you're talking about with the wedding cake and the dancing. And one way I think that to really understand the photographs in the book and the meaning of photographs for queer and trans people over time is that photographs really are a form of affirmation, right? That taking a photograph of people is not only about preserving something for the future, but also about affirming it in the present. And so taking these photographs, I think, was so meaningful because it signals the importance of this and the desire to make this visible, even if just to the people here. These photographs were from a wedding that took place in Philadelphia, just in someone's apartment in the 1950s. What's really tragic about these photographs is that they brought them to a drugstore, a local drugstore, to have them developed, and the owner refused to give them back because he said that they were obscene. And the only way we know this is because eventually the drugstore owner's daughter found them and decided to donate them to an archive, to the One Archives in California. And I think it's really important to feel the violence in that, to feel the violence of someone telling you that you can't have photographs of your own wedding, and how harmful that would have been, right, on the other side of that. I think that it also speaks to then, right, the importance of just how important these images were. And this is another photograph from the book of a retreat called Casa Susana that was created by a trans activist named Susanna Valenti and her wife. It was really one of the first kind of retreats for trans women in the United States. And of course, in this photograph, you can see that all the women here are taking a photograph of another woman named Lily. And I think it also signals, again, the importance of photography as a mode of reflecting, right? And again, a mode of affirmation. And this is happening in home and it's happening in private. And some of these photographs might have appeared in the magazine, a magazine that was circulating at the time that Virginia Prince had published. This is another photograph you mentioned of a butch femme couple living in Philadelphia in the 1950s. And this is another image from the book by Sam Stewart. Importantly, this was a Polaroid picture that he took. Polaroid comes out, the Polaroid camera comes out in the early 1950s, and was amazing for somebody like Sam Stewart who could actually take photographs of his lovers and people at his home. Stewart goes on to become a kind of key informant for Kinsey in his studies of sexuality. The other thing I love about this image is that Stewart has actually drawn this figure kind of two men kind of on the wall behind his Murphy bed. So if he pulled down his Murphy bed, you'd see this image, this fantasy that he had drawn, but then he also has a lover kind of seated there, kind of in the same pose, that fantasy kind of becoming reality. I mean, this is the Liberation House that I was mentioning before, of the Liberation House in DC. And just to notice here that, right, it feels like a family portrait, right? Everyone gathered on the couch. And then behind them, you'll notice this banner. And so it's that banner that Reggie Haynes then brings to the Christopher Street Liberation Day March in New York, the early gay pride march in DC. Again, kind of that work of making home public. And so again, I think with all of these, you really get a sense of how this provided, again, a new kind of affirmation and helped kind of preserve these as moments, signal these were moments that mattered.
And it also strikes me that there's a sense in which photography was must have played a powerful role in bringing gay lives to the wider world, and to the straight world, and sort of technology kind of developing in step with gay liberation.
One of the places the book ends in the same chapter is the buddy program. I talk about a TV show that GMHC created for public access in New York called Living with AIDS, which like you could see on a weekly basis, right? And airing stories about people just living with HIV/AIDS and often going into their home spaces, demonstrating things like how to cook, or just talking about their lives in ways that would have been really radical. And it's fascinating because the New York Public Library also has viewer surveys, like from people who are watching it, saying how meaningful that show was, how meaningful it was to see their own, see people who had lives like them, or not quite like them, but similar, right? Mm-hmm. Reflected on, on a mainstream media like TV. And that is really radical. I think, again, as you're saying, kind of reflects the ways that queer and trans people also understood kind of intuitively, right, that technology and really home video technology and home photograph technology was going to enable them to make their private lives public in a way that was potentially going to be meaningful to not only the queer people, but also challenge straight people in terms of thinking about what was possible.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to actually switch over to I'm going to hop into the Q&A, and we have a question here that I'm going to ask. This is from Chris Phillips. Given your interest in photography, how did you select the cover photo for the book?
Thanks so much for that question, Chris. That was the photograph. I will say that I wrote like a really long email to everyone at University of Chicago Press and sort of really advocated for that photograph. It's a photograph I really love on the book because it's an image from Survival House of a group of residents just playing Monopoly. And I really love that image because one, of course, is that they're playing Monopoly, like a game that's all about acquiring property, but it's being played by this group of unhoused young people. And I'm fascinated kind of in the kind of irony and kind of how that exposes to me one of the ironies of the book about the ways that home can be really oppressive, right? And not everybody has the privilege of being at home or having a sense of home. But then also in the context of the book, right, that they're also around this board game, sitting on couches and making home for each other in ways that are really meaningful. And it's also a really, it's a group that's coming together, right? We don't know all of their stories, but they're working on transforming shelter into home. And that, for me, of thinking about home as a process of creation is really central to the book. And so that was one of the reasons I for a long time really wanted that photograph to be the cover of the book.
So actually, I have another question that I'd like to ask you, sort of that grows out of the communes chapter. I think the commune has always been a sort of powerful idea in the culture, the idea of creating a group of people who are just like yourself and in some way separating yourselves and being kind of bound together by some shared qualities. But what's interesting is that as in many cases in your chapter, a lot of these communes did fall apart because of either internal conflicts or jealousies or from outside pressure in some form or another. So I'm wondering what writing about gay communes impressed upon you about the way we act in groups versus the way we live in or act in couples or as individuals.
Writing about the communes, I think the thing that really struck me repeatedly was how much optimism people had in forming communes, and how they really thought it was going to reshape what gender looked like, what sexuality looked like, the boundaries of race and class, and really a kind of utopian impulse, but also the way that kind of reality begins to impinge on that, right? As you were suggesting too, and that's not, in the gay communes, it's also on, there are a lot of, I also talk about in the book, lesbian lands that lesbian feminists were forming, kind of retreats, kind of in more rural spaces, right, to get away from men. To me, it says less about like anything about groups versus individuals, but also just about the challenge of creating home in any form, right? That we have a lot of emotional and often political investments in the homes that we create, and we have a lot of ideas about what homes should look like, but we're always kind of faced also with reality, right? As soon as you set up everything in your house a certain way, things begin to get messy. And it's that messiness of the book, is that messiness of home that I also find really fascinating in the book. And so, the fact that the Gay Liberation House in DC like only lasts about 5 years that to me is actually kind of remarkable. That's really long for a gay commune in a city, right, where there's a lot of activity going on and a lot of pressures, right, that people are facing. And I think that I hope that one of the things the book also helps us to think about is that a failure of any one experiment doesn't mean that that experiment wasn't worthwhile, or that it doesn't mean that it doesn't have resonances beyond that, because many of the people in the Gay Liberation House go on to create new activist groups that also things like Black and White Men Together, that kind of continue that model of challenging racism and try and think about what a kind of multiracial coalition in queer community might look like. And so a failure, right, of a fantasy doesn't mean that it isn't still transformative.
Sure, yeah. We have another question here from Carl Gilbert Murray, who asks, do you differentiate between everyday images and images from the visual arts community to illustrate your point?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. It's interesting thinking about the photographs that I was sharing, right, where I think that those early snapshots that I was sharing and like the Polaroid photographs, I do think that those have a kind of different, I guess, historical significance, right? Because they really are about kind of ordinary queer and queer people and trans people trying to represent themselves, like for themselves, right? And later in the book, I think there's a bit more of maybe an outward facing project where, where Bruce Pavlov makes a documentary about Survival House and then screens it at one of the early gay film festivals in San Francisco, right? There's a goal of kind of making it public. I think that, and so and Susan Cookland is a young journalist, young photojournalist at the time, that she is working on a book about the buddy program. To me, that's fascinating, actually, though, because to me, it's about the ways that coalitions work in the book. That Susan, for instance, Cookland essentially kind of becomes a part of that buddy program by following them for so long, and so there is a bit of ways that she's somewhat an outsider, but kind of becomes a participant observer. And I think that also speaks to the ways that sometimes photographs also actually are a way of creating a sense of intimacy, right? And I think that photographers work in different ways, but I think for Susan Cookland and Bruce Pavlov at Survival House, that certainly their photographic work was a way of connection that that maybe has a different political edge by virtue of it being intended for a wider audience from the start.
Let's see. I'm going to ask a couple more questions. You finished the book and are publishing it at a time when COVID has totally reshaped how we think about home. And I think actually I think that COVID has sort of reinforces the point, something that you point to in the Queerness of Home, which is that sort of duality that, homes can be places of safety and comfort and care, and also can be confining and isolating in certain instances. And I'm wondering how your own experiences of the past 2 years, is there any way that they've cast a new light on the ideas that you had or the discoveries that you made while you were researching the book?
I think it really reinforced, I think the last 2 years really reinforced like a shift in my thinking about home that kind of was already happening. I think when I started the book with something like the Gay Cookbook, I had a very, I think, kind of celebratory stance in relationship to home, because I saw the ways that Hogan and the communes were really trying to see home as a site of liberation and community and connection. But over the course of working on the book over many years, I also started to really begin to understand the way that home could also be really isolating. Right? What makes the buddy program so meaningful when it emerges is because home was so isolating for a lot of people living with HIV, right? That they needed someone to come in, or they were homebound and couldn't leave their home. So I finished the manuscript, right, and the edits of the book, right, when we were pretty much under lockdown at home in Ithaca. And I think that certainly made me think about the ways that home was both a site of safety, right, and stability, but also intensely isolating in the way that so many people around me seemed very isolated. It also, though, at the same time reinforced for me the ways that home kind of can operate as a portal to the public, where, right, of course, and we are, of course, right now are zooming into this event from our home, right? And there's so many ways that we had to learn, right? Of course, we're always in the position of deciding about who gets to be in our home and who isn't, right? Who do we invite in or not? But there are ways, of course, that COVID kind of shook that up, right? And sort of made the kind of welcoming people into your home, right, virtually, right, very normal. And I think exposes the way that home is always a kind of, never purely private, but actually always a kind of mediated privacy. My fear now, I think, is that there's a kind of reprivatization that's happening. Like I think about that moment in New York when everybody was sort of leaning out their windows and clapping for first responders, right? This kind of moment when everyone's from their private space is forming a public. And I feel like right now there are still a lot of people who, for various reasons are not going to be able to simply get back to normal in that same way. And the way that I think this return to normal necessarily sort of reprivatizes a lot of those experiences.
Yeah. I have another question that just popped up in the chat. This is from Matt Disson. Did geography play a large role in your research on the home and communities, both with various differences between regions as well as city versus small town life?
Thanks so much for that question. I do spend a lot of time in the book talking about cities because I think that was often like where a lot of the activism was happening. Where I go most kind of into kind of rural life is in tracking some of the gay and lesbian communes in the 70s, and also places like Casa Susanna, right, in the Catskills in the 50s. And I think that one of the things I see kind of as a distinction, right, there's a lot of the queer communes last longer, right, once they move to the country. And I think that's because there's a lot more space and there's a lot more room, right, to sort of change and grow and over time, that maybe felt people really, I mean, to build a commune in a small apartment in New York City is kind of really challenging. I think there are other regional differences in the book that are maybe a little bit harder to fully unpack. That there are a lot of early gay and lesbian, a lot of shelters, like in group homes for LGBTQ homeless youth that emerged in California in the 1970s, in New York, and sorry, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles. There are also some in Philadelphia, but there aren't any in New York City. And so that might be a larger story also about the ways that New York City, right, is geographically and sort of architecturally and structurally different than places like San Francisco, where you could in 1970s, like basically rent out or buy a whole, a house, right, to be able to create that kind of new shelter. I think those differences are there and are a place to kind of keep exploring this story.
Stephen, I'd like to ask you one last question. What are you working on now? Do you have another book project in the works?
So I'm working right now on, I'm thinking about kind of two projects that I've been thinking of for a while. So one of them is a book I've been thinking about called On Our Own, that I've started to do some research and writing about, looking at kind of what happens after all of the state mental hospitals in New York are shut down in the 1960s and 70s, kind of what actually happened to all the people with mental illness and mental disabilities and intellectual disabilities who are living in those mental hospitals. And it's partly, again, kind of goes back to my own personal history. In the town I grew up in Long Beach, there were a lot of people who had been released from state mental hospitals who moved to Long Beach, and some of the older hotels along the boardwalk were being converted essentially into nursing homes. And the city actually actively tried to ban people with mental illness from moving to the town. And so that question to me about sort of how do communities respond again to difference is really important, but also tracing some of the activism of former patients who were trying to build new forms of supportive housing for themselves. The title of the book comes from Judy Chamberlain, who writes a book called On Our Own about patient-controlled alternatives to mental health care in the 1970s. The other project I've been thinking about for a long time kind of comes out of my research on homeless, queer, and trans youth, to write a longer history about runaway and transient and homeless youth in the United States, and to think about how that category of runaway or transient youth kind of evolved over time. Like, we sort of know a lot of that story from the 60s, which was a moment when there were a lot of young people, especially young white middle class people, who are running away to cities like San Francisco and New York. And there's a lot of discussion in major magazines about that. But the history of runaways kind of dates back right to the early 20th century and runaway youth, and even to the into the 19th century. And the category of runaway also kind of transitions from talking about people who had run away from slavery or from enslavement, and it starts to be talked about in terms of young people. And so I'm really interested in sort of, how does this category of runaway youth emerge? And how does it go from being a category of essentially criminalized behavior, right? Because until the 1960s, if a young person had run away from their home, they would most likely be put into the juvenile justice system. That changes after the 1960s and 70s. And so I'm curious about that transition and what that tells us also about how we understand young people. How do we understand youth as a category of personhood, right? That seems actually so natural to us, but actually has its own history. And similar to the Queerness of Home, I think that by looking at the people who are kind of outside of the norm, we can actually learn more about how those norms evolve and change.
Excellent. I look forward to those. They both sound really great. Terrific. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk. And
thank you so much, Peter, for these such really great and wonderful and generous questions. And again, taking time to be here today. It's so lovely and wonderful to see you.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
And thank you, Stephen and Peter, for this fantastic discussion tonight. I could sit here and listen to you talk for another hour, but I'm afraid our time may be up. And again, thank you all for joining us this evening. One last pitch, don't forget to buy your copy of The Queerness of Home in store or online. Thank you so much all, and have a great night.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Have a good night.